Swifter, how appropriate that I'm recording this on Valentine's Day because we've got a date with dates and times. We're going to learn how to format times using DateFormatters. We'll use the DateFormatter string method so that we can take a date and format it into a lovingly presented date and time. We'll learn about date styles. We'll learn about time styles. We'll learn about caching DateFormatters. And we'll do this by using private let. Swifter, you've got a date with awesomeness. Let's get going. Now, Swift has a date type, but its default prints out in a rather unfriendly format. Dates are also tricky because they could be a matter of preference or culture. Dates in the United States are often written month first and then day. In Europe, they're often written day first and then month. There are time zones. There can be different calendars. It's all pretty complex. Now, iOS can help us out. It has a DateFormatter class, which, surprise, allows us to format dates. We're only going to scratch the surface now, but we'll cover more on dates in a future project. For now, we just want the date from our date picker to be shown in a nice format in the date labels text property on screen. So to do this, we'll need to create a date formatter. We'll need to set the date and time styles, and there are quite a few styles. We'll experiment with those in just a bit. And we'll use the DateFormatters.string conversion method. Now, there's another issue that we'll address in just a bit on date efficiency, but for now, let's take a look at these styles in the playground. So let's create a playground. We'll do File, New, Playground. It'll be a blank playground. We'll call this DateFormatters, save it to the desktop, and we can begin. I'll expand the window, get rid of the str, and create a date formatter using let date formatter equals, and then capital date formatter with open and close parentheses. That goes to the date formatter blueprint and creates an object of that type and puts it in lower camel case date formatter. Now, even though I've set this as a constant, the type capital date formatter is a class. The properties of that class that we're going to be using are variables, so we'll be able to change them. Now I'm going to set up and print the different formats inside the date formatter, so I'll say print short just to distinguish it in the output. And date formatters have a date style and a time style, so let's set both of those. So we'll say date formatter dot date style equals dot short, and date formatter dot time style equals dot short as well. Now that we've got the date style and time style set up, we can just say date formatter dot string to convert a date to a string, open parentheses, the from accepts something of type date, and we'll just say capital date, open and close parens. That'll give us the current date and time. And I'll enclose this whole statement inside of a print statement and press Shift Return, and Happy Valentine's Day! There's the short format. Now I'll copy these 4 lines and paste them below. I'll say \n medium so that I get a line feed before printing medium. Set the formats to .medium and .medium. I'll do the same thing to show the long format and also the full format, which is very wordy. And on this last one, let's demonstrate the none format. So the none format is useful if you want to have just a date or just a time style and you want nothing to show up for the other ones. So we'll just show date style as .medium and time style as .none. Then I'll Shift Enter, expand the print area, and we can see the different formats. So short is nice and short, and the other ones are medium long, extra long, and we can see what none does. It just shows the date but not the time. So good. Now we've got a basic introduction to date and time styles. And we use this inside of a date formatter object that we created using the date formatter class, and we converted them to strings. Now here's one last thing to be aware of. Apple warns in their documentation that creating a date formatter is not a cheap operation. That means it actually takes a little bit of time and takes some processing power as well. So if you're likely to use a date formatter frequently, it's typically more efficient to cache, meaning save, a single instance than to create and dispose of multiple instances. Now frankly, this is not a big deal for our app. We're not doing a whole lot with dates, but if, for example, you had a very long table and you were doing a formatting in every single row, then that might tax the device, it'll use up more power than necessary, and we want things to be efficient. So I'm going to show you a technique that we can use to create a formatter, and this formatter is going to live. So the very first time we need the date formatter, it will be created, and then we can use it whenever we return to the view controller where we did this. Now we're going to do this in our to-do detail table view controller. That's where we're formatting our dates. And I'm actually going to put this statement outside of the formal class. Now by doing this, it's going to be available to that class, so to our to-do detail table view controller, but it's not going to be destroyed every time we get out of that table view controller and back into it. And just to show you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to print out this statement. We'll see the very first time we need a date formatter that it's created, but we'll see that this isn't called again, even though we regularly use the date formatter. Another thing to note is it's also expensive to change the styles of the date formatter. So if for some reason you think you're going to need different styles, you'll probably want to create a different date formatter for those different styles. Now, if you're curious, there's been a lot written online about the efficiency and different techniques to be able to create and cache reusable date formatters. This is the one that I prefer. It works great in our context. We only need date formatters in one class, so we'll stick with this. Now, there's one last thing that I want to point out here. The syntax looks a little bit different. We haven't seen anything like this before. So let means we're creating a new constant. Date formatter we saw as well. But hey, how are we initializing this date formatter? Well, we saw in our playground, we created the date formatter and we set up a date and time style. That's exactly what we're doing here inside of the curlies. And what we're doing when we initialize this value is we're using what's called a closure. This is essentially a block of code. In this case, we're going to return a value. So it's almost like having a function that's used to initialize this value. The parentheses at the end say, hey, go ahead and return this value. The value that we're returning is not only the blank date formatter, but we're also configuring it as well. So Swift allows us to do this, to perform several different statements, to set up a value, and then return it. Private means it can just be used inside of the class file where it was created. So let's go ahead and use this new technique. And now we're back in our to-do list. I'm going to get into to-do detail table view controller.swift, and up top, just after UI kit and just before class, which we've never put stuff in before, this is where we're going to set up this cacheable date formatter. So we're going to start by saying private. It's only going to be available and accessible inside of this file, and we'll say let DateFormatter DateFormatter upper camel case, which is the name of the class, equals, and then inside of these curly braces we'll execute several different statements. The statements will create and configure a date formatter, and then we'll return the date formatter back, assigning this now configured date formatter back to this constant. So inside here, the first thing we do is create another date formatter. So we'll say let date formatter equal date formatter, open and close parens. Next line is date formatter dot date style equals dot short. We'll do the same thing for the time. So we'll say date formatter dot time style equals dot short. And so now that we've created a date formatter and configured it, we just return date formatter, and this thing we just set up is slapped into this constant date formatter. Now also after the curlies, I need to do an open and close parenthesis. Again, this executes just like a function when you do open and close parentheses afterward. And just to show you that this is created once and only once, I'm going to put a print statement in here that says, I just created a date formatter. And why don't we put in a little emoji so that we can see this too. So I'll pull up the calendar emoji. There we go. Looking good. So once we create this date formatter, we want to use it. Where do we want to use it? Well, every time we change our date in the date picker, we should update our date label. But gadzooks, my friend, we cannot do that. We don't have any IB action for our date picker. So let's go ahead and set that up. So I'm inside of to-do table detail view controller. I'm going to option click on main storyboard. These guys are side by side. I'm going to find my date picker, make sure that I've clicked on it. So it's always good to consult your document outline. This is going to be an IB action, so I'll put it at the end of my class just before my extension. Control drag over, set the type to UI date picker, give it a name, date picker changed, lower camel case, and click connect. And then inside here, I'm just going to put in one statement. I'll say date label.text equals, now that's expecting a string, so I'll say date formatter, the date formatter that we create above. I'll close my main storyboard to give me some more room in here, and then say dot string. Now this wants a date. What date do we want? We want the date that's on the date picker. Well, since this is an IB action from the date picker, we can refer to sender, which is the date picker that we just changed the date on. And that date picker has a property .date, which we used before, that gives us a date. So we'll just say datepicker.date. So we'll build and run. We're not quite there, but if I click on plus to add a new record, since it is Valentine's Day, we'll say, prepare Valentine's meal for the fam. Now I still have this default 12-12-12 text in here, so we want to get rid of that. But notice, as soon as we move the date picker, our IB action we just wrote fires, it takes the date from the label, configures it using the date formatter, and the date shows up in the date label. Nice. Let's set time to make dinner today at 6 p.m. Click save. And now if we click back on Prepare Valentine's Meal, we see that the date picker was updated properly, but we haven't updated our date label yet. So we want to make sure that we do that when we update our user interface. So now back in our code, let's go to Update User Interface. We'll add another line under here. We'll say DateLabel.text equals, and that'll be DateFormatter.string from, and we're going to get that date from the to-do item dot, and we have a date property in there that we were updating. Press return. And so now we've got Update User Interface. When we get into the view controller, what about when we leave the view controller? That's in Prepare for Segue. And yep, when we update our to-do item, we're getting it from DatePicker.date, so that's solid. Let's do one other tweak here too. So when we create a new to-do item, what we're doing right now is we're setting up the date as the current date and time. Now that's probably not very realistic because you don't want to set a reminder for the very second that you've clicked on plus. So what we can do is we can advance the time for a certain period of time. So right after where I have capital date, open and close parentheses, if I type in a period here, I get a bunch of different methods, and one of them is named adding time interval, and then it wants a time interval afterward. Time intervals are actually just seconds. So it says create a new date value by adding a time interval to this date. Date, open and close parentheses, is the current time. So if we want to add a number of seconds there to go to 24 hours from now, we'll say 24 hours times 60 minutes times 60 seconds. That'll give us 1 day from the current date and time. So now let's test some things out. We'll build and run. I'll give a little bit of room over here, and let's pay attention to when we get that printout down below that says when we've created the date formatter. So we can see our print statement. Here's our prepare Valentine's Day meal. Look, it's read in here perfectly. We also see down here it printed out, I just created a date formatter. Now if I press cancel, our running program actually gets rid of the view controller. It's not loaded anymore. Now when I click on Be the Change, watch what happens. A new view controller is loaded up, but I don't see another print statement. That means that I've effectively cached the date formatter. It doesn't need to be recreated, because if it was recreated, we'd see another print statement down below. Good work. Now I'm in Be the Change, which actually already had one of those old formatted dates in here, so that's why we're seeing it here. But if I click on Set a Reminder, oh, why don't you be the change today at noon? Let's save, then click back on Be the Change. Oh man, everything loads up perfectly, but that's too much pressure to be the change so quickly. Let's change it till tomorrow at noon and click save. Everything is looking good. Now I'll create a new to-do in here, and your date is different, but trust me, this is 1 day after the current date, which is Valentine's Day when I'm recording this, so that's why I see my reminder goes in February 15th, 24 hours after the exact moment when I'm recording this video. Outstanding! Nice work, Swifter. Hope you're feeling you understand dates. You have a date with awesomeness.